Welcome to episode 6, Ourselves and Others. I'm your host, Mick Larson, producer and director of the documentary series, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day? I'll be introducing you to the professors, authors, journalists, and theologians that contributed to the documentary series. Don't forget, you can watch the documentary series online for free at www.jd.vote. All right, let's get started with episode 6, Ourselves and Others. The first voice you'll hear is mine, followed by Professor Karina Korostellina. She's a professor and director of the program on prevention of mass violence and the program on history, memory, and conflict at the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. She's also the author of Political Insults: How Offenses Escalate Conflict. When I started working on this documentary 5 years ago, I really wanted to end on a message of hope and a way forward. Luckily, I did find that way forward while making this film. But before we get into the way forward, I want to share 2 big lessons I learned while working on this project. I'll call this first lesson, what are we doing to ourselves and to others?
Basic idea of social identity theory that in order to achieve our own positive self-esteem, we actually need to compare ourselves with others and put others down. In my work, I speaking about locus of self-esteem. One locus exactly, to achieve what you want to achieve, to build, to develop, and to be proud of who you are. I love this example from Big Fat Greek Wedding movie. Remember how he's telling there are 2 types of people, Greeks and people who want to be Greek. So this idea that we're much better, everyone just wish they are Greek. It's this idea of internal locus of self-esteem. But it's very hard for many people to achieve this internal locus of self-esteem, so they use external locus of self-esteem. They put down other people and compare. You see, I'm better. I'm better. Look at these people, not educated or color of skin. It's the most easiest. It's to pick on color of skin or pick on ethnicity or pick on citizenship, which it's easy for people. It's really working for them as an instrument of increasing their feeling of themselves. So prejudice and biases are not something which is basic for a human being. It's a result of our striving to feel more positive about ourselves. But unfortunately, yes, there is a dark side of our opportunity to feel good about ourselves. And what is important, I think, in this is understanding why people need these particular groups, why they don't really feel about themselves, right? If you live in society and you independent, you have your own values, right? You have your own views, you have your own beliefs, you have your own perceptions, and you're completely free to decide, you're free to act, you're free to be independent person. But if something happened to you, if there is some threat in society, who will come and help you? Nobody, right? Because you're not connected, you're individual, you're staying free. So you need you need a group that will help you. So you're looking for the groups, which, again, it can be ethnic, national, gender, regional, whatever, the group which can help you. But why a group will help you? Why actually a group will put their efforts on helping you and supporting you? You have to pay with something for it. And what happening, you pay with loyalty. You become loyal. What does it mean to be loyal? You accept values, perceptions, beliefs of this group. And the more you become loyal, the more you're losing your freedom of thoughts. So it's really a dilemma between freedom and security. You get in your security by being more loyal and more affiliated with the group, but at the same time, you're not free anymore. You think like a group member. You perceive everything as a group member. You act as a group member. And when we speak about groups, you are not now think about person to person, you think group to group. Usually people try to find secure groups in situation of threat. And what happens, it actually creates this evil, this circle. So then you search for the group which protects you and support you, you become more loyal, so you become thinking more like a group. So you see other group as more and more evil. You're not making your own decision anymore. You think you act as a group member. And it's actually what happened in the United States, a deepening of this divide between people, because people are not acting anymore as just independent individuals with their views. They act as members of their group with liberal perception, more conservative perception. This is how they define themselves, because they feel threat to their value system. You don't have to have threat only for your life.
Next up is Paula Ioannidis, Associate Professor at the Center for Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity at Ithaca College. She's also the author of Emotional Politics of Racism: How Feelings Trump Facts in an Era of Colorblindness.
I always ask myself, why isn't there the political will to even do what's economically in our own interest? And the only answer I can come up with is that we bought into this narrative, this myth of we're better than these other people, so much so that the psychological sort of little rewards we get for that almost sort of trump our own economic interests to some degree, because since you could even argue that at this point, neoliberalism and this kind of global economy is in this multinational corporation takeover is actually now, really shrinking the wealth of even the white middle class and certainly the white working class, right? I mean, we've been reading about it. So it used to be that there was a kind of correlation between the policies and this kind of white middle class and white advantage, but that's actually increasingly not true. And so it begs the question of why do even white Americans sort of act against their own economic interests, right? And certainly people on the conservative right. And for some people, it's about these social issues like abortion and, these kinds of beliefs that are very dear to who people are. But in other cases, I'm not sure if it's a matter of political ignorance of how things actually work, or if there's actually a kind of pleasure principle, right, in sort of denigrating these various scapegoats and still continuing to gain this idea that, you're gonna be the exception and you're gonna make it somehow,
All right, we are back with Professor Karina Korostelina.
I always like to go and bring some historic examples to understand what's going on right now. It's always bringing us a little bit out of current emotions of current situation and understanding something which more distant to us. And for me, one of the best examples to understand what actually happening right now in the United States is example of Little Rock, Arkansas. Then it's already history, some people know better about it. What actually happened there is that the federal law required desegregation of communities. Little Rock, Arkansas had to choose several schools to become desegregated schools. Little Rock, Arkansas had three major communities. Rich whites who had complete control of the city, blue collar whites, poor, and African American community. This the blue collar whites, poor whites, they didn't have control of the city at all. They didn't have money. They live in very poor environment, very poor communities. But at the same time, they were feeling they are better than these African Americans. It gives them self-esteem. They were feeling better. They feel like they own the city. Then city council come together and decided what we are actually doing about this desegregation. They had to choose several schools. Of course, it's not a surprise. Then they choose schools which were placed in white, poor regions. They didn't choose any school which was in a rich school. So what happened for these white people, they're now knowing that social boundary change. If before it was before whites and African American, now it's between poor and rich. They will protest and they will become so aggressive. They become mobs. They will throwing stones into children, African American children going to schools. So they actually had to call the National Reserve and police to support every single a child going into schools with so much negativity toward this, because they feel threat to their identity. They feel threat to their sources of self-esteem. If you look into the small case of the small little rock and try to apply it for the entire to United States, you will see a very similar pattern.
We again hear from Associate Professor Paula Ioannidis.
A deep sense of self-worth cannot be given by someone else, right? You have to actually create it yourself. It has to come through a kind of self-creation process. And it cannot depend on other people's affirmation or denial of who you are. And whenever you witness somebody who has that deep sense of confidence and self-worth that isn't dependent on somebody else's denigration, you see a kind of spiritual peace. And because they're no longer sort of dependent on gaining their sense of superiority through someone else. It's sort of a self-referential process, or maybe it's in relation to their own principles of what they think they're here to do, right? And what I think it creates at a widespread level is a kind of spiritual depravity, right? Because to denigrate someone else constantly actually distances yourself from them. It necessarily has to do so, right? But we've often, I think, don't consider the fact that whenever you put someone else down, you're actually also deadening your own experience, because you're investing in a form of disconnection constantly. And whenever you're disconnected from other people, the way that we're disconnected from the earth right now and its resources, and we feel like we could just exploit it ad nauseum and not have any repercussions, right? When you're that disconnected from, the earth and other people, you're also disconnected from yourself. And when you're disconnected from yourself, there's a price to be paid there, I think, in terms of having to constantly fill yourself with a kind of, with all of these external forms of value. I have a nice car, I'm superior to this group of people. I'm, women competing with each other, all kinds of, beauty and all this kind of stuff. And that's, I think, a mass structure that's rooted in what we've been habituated in learning from racism, from sexism, from homophobia, from all of these forms of denigration and oppression, right? And I don't think people think about that price to the advantaged, that you've actually become a deeply alienated, spiritually disconnected person from other people and from yourself, that you almost cannot feel deeply, right? To understand that your life is linked with the fate of others. And I'm kind of working on thinking about that price, right? Because we often don't see it, and yet we see its reverberations in today's society. I mean, these mass shootings, these constant forms of everyday violence, right? I think that they're symptoms of this spiritual depravity, right? Of not understanding how we're linked to one another and not understanding how to honor one another as a result of that.
Next, we hear from me again, setting up the next section of this episode. Then we'll hear from Dr. James Sacita, Director of the Multicultural Center at Cal State Long Beach. The other lesson I learned while making this documentary would seem rather obvious, but it's not really something we think about, and it's extremely important to our history and to our future. And that is the lesson of the victors write the history.
The grand narrative, which again is a cover-up for reality. You're not going to be told, well, the United States was built upon slavery and genocide. Its wealth was from enslaving human beings, of which we've never acknowledged nor apologized for. And the genocide against the indigenous people are not even on the radar of conversation. So whatever grand outcomes you think the country had was on the backs of enslaved human beings, or on the elimination of 500 nations that preceded European contact. So again, we have cultural amnesia, historic amnesia. We have no idea of cultural history.
All right, we are back with Paula.
And one would think that we are deeply invested in sort of a questioning process, a critical thinking process to examine the false beliefs we may have been handed down either by our parents or our families or our educational system, which largely relies on a set of myths rather than actual factual history, But what, for me, the political moment begs the question of, are we going to shape some political myths or, some narratives that are actually closer to the truth, that actually appeal to people, but on other grounds than this kind of the pleasure that people gain from sort of scapegoating someone else?
Next up is Daryl Wing Su, professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. He's also the author of Race, Talk, and the Conspiracy of Silence.
The group that owns history, the group that is able to define reality, is a group that has power. When you tell a Native American that Columbus discovered America, and when teachers test students as to their knowledge and ask a question, true, false, Columbus discovered America, and all the white students say that's Mickey Mouse and that it's true, but Native Americans say, that it isn't true, they get an incorrect score and are told that there is something wrong in their intelligence or knowledge of history. This is what I call cultural oppression, where the reality of one group, and that's oftentimes related to whiteness as well. This is something that we were referring to, that whiteness is an invisible standard that is enforced on individuals. And because whiteness is a background, white Western ways, it is invisible to people who are white Americans, but it's not invisible to people of color. It's like a fish that is in a bowl of water swimming, doesn't see the water until they're out of it. Yet the water represents something toxic and unhealthy to people of color. And this is where we get the clash of racial realities. Now, you may ask, whose racial reality is the correct reality? I mean, that's what I get all the time. And luckily, there is social psychological studies that answer that question. What they find is that on matters of bias, the group that is most disempowered has the most accurate perception of reality. And this is not something innate to people, but I can just simply ask you the question, if you're a white woman working in corporate America that is dominated by white men, for you, a white woman, to do well, you have to really understand the thinking of your white male counterparts and the rules and regulations or policies and procedures of a Western white corporate world in order to do well. White men don't need to understand the thinking of white women to do well. And the same analogy applies to people of color. If I enter into an organization, a corporation that is primarily white in orientation, I need to really understand the thinking of white colleagues and white Western ways to do well, but they don't have to understand me as an Asian American. The other thing I frequently ask people is this, that if you really want to understand sexism, do you ask men or women? If you want to understand heterosexism, do you ask straights or gay? And likewise, if you want to understand racism, do you ask whites or people of color? The answer to me is obvious. And I see oftentimes in Congress where they'll be talking about things dealing with a women's right to health. And all the panelists are white men who are sitting there making the decisions. They really don't have the ability to empathize or understand completely the worldview of people who differ from them.
Next, we hear from Shelley Tucklock, professor in the education department at Mount St. Mary's University. She's also the author of Witnessing Whiteness: The Need to Talk About Race and How to Do It.
It was a really difficult thing in my 20s to start to reconcile the fact that I had been raised with an ideology that was beautiful and uplifting, and I thought brought people together. And what I was hearing from so many people around me is that was not the reality of the history as they understood it. And here's where I think a lot of us struggle. How to have both and live together. It is not either everything was glorious and wonderful or everything was 100% horrible and awful and we have to reject everything. And that process sometimes involves us living in either world for a while. That's what happened to me. I had grown up within the patriotic frame, and then I shifted to one where I would be just like so many hardcore activists, just not able to even mention the founding fathers' names without a sneer. Could not imagine the possibility of valuing anything that had come during the time period where slavery was enacted. Nothing could be redeemed. And over time, I've had to find this place of balance, of understanding, yes, people are people of their time, and there is horror within that. And that is a hard place to rest. But I don't think enough of us are willing to even imagine that. And I think part of the reason why, at least what I experienced, was when I was asked to see myself associated with a history that has so much trauma and violence and oppression linked to it, it felt like my entire worldview had to change. And let's not be unclear about what a difficult thing that is for a lot of people. For someone to accept what today is being offered as the need for diversity, equity, inclusion, for many people is a complete and radical change of mind frame about all of what they've known. And to accept and go down that path, that particular framing, which is something that I now fully accept, admittedly, also puts people into jeopardy in their own friendship and family relationships. Because it means that to accept and go down this path might mean arguments, might mean rejection from those that they love. And so there's, I think, a lot of understandable fear around what it means to adopt a completely different worldview. I still think it's worth the effort. I think my experience with my own family is a good model even for me about the fact that we can educate one another, we can recover from that amnesia that we've had in terms of ignoring so much of our history. But it does take work. My capacity to engage with people across race had been undermined, because if all I know is, oh yeah, racism happened way back then and it's 3 pages worth of my textbook, then I don't have any sense of the depth of trauma and what happened since then. Whereas now that I've taken it up as an exploration and a personal mission to learn more about it, I'm just as infuriated as many people who are out there protesting, because what I understand is that I was not given the tools to be able to engage well. I wasn't given the tools to be able to understand how our current systems and current policies are actually acting out of some old assumptions, some old mythology, and some of the old manipulative cons that we were subjected to that actually prompted us to buy in to a system that was unjust at its core and has never gotten to the point of full equity. And so what do I say to people when they say, oh, but this was so long ago? I'll say, we had 400 years of affirmative action for white people. So having a very short period of time where some things were being tried in order to make some amends and create some level of equity, it hasn't been enough, clearly.
All right, we're back with Paula.
For as long as this country has had this faction that we've spent most of our time talking about, it's also had this other faction constantly trying to wage for its soul in the other direction, right? So that it actually lives up to its ideals of equality, of due process under the law. I mean, it's really bizarre. It sets up these ideals and then in practice does pretty terribly at meeting them. And yet there's been these incredible radical factions, right? Radical in terms of trying to keep uprooting the nation, right? To actually shift more and more towards that, what Martin Luther King would call that long arch of history towards justice, right? And it's that kind of person that reminded me, oh my gosh, there is this possibility here too, right? Of a kind of Christianity that actually reckons with its past and is willing to self-examine, as white Americans, right, are looking to look at the legacy of the convergence between Christianity and white supremacy and really think through, what does that mean? What do we owe as a result of that? Not just economic reparations, but the spiritual dimension of the kind of transformation we would have to go through in order to change the system of exploitation and denigration that we've relied on for hundreds of years. I mean, that kind of self-examination, although you see it rarely, exists as a kind of undercurrent as well. And, it's the thing that I try to focus on to kind of keep me going during these times, because if I didn't, well, that and cross-racial alliances and, this incredible ongoing presence, right, of Black people's movements, of Latino people's movements, of all of these different marginalized groups that have done so much to try to pull us towards that other aspect of the soul, like the restoration of the soul, as I call it, in the sense of like the American ideals that we supposedly are supposed to live up to.
Next up is racial justice educator and activist Debbie Irving. She's the author of Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race.
Societies have always had myths. I don't think myths in themselves are bad. And when you think about the idea of white superiority, I can tell you firsthand, I think I achieved more in life because of the confidence that came with that idea. I just think everyone should believe that they have the potential to be fantastic people. So I don't have a problem with feeling great about myself and having myths around me that remind me of the nobility that comes with being a human being and the potential in every human being. It's the fact that it's not every. It's the fact that, like every other resource, it's doled out to some people. And if I'm here saying, I've been able to achieve more in life because I was told I was special, what does the opposite of that look like? What's it like to be told everywhere you look that you're flawed? That's not, I don't want to live in that world.
We'll hear again from Dr. James Sacita.
The truth forces us to self-reflect on our failures. It forces us to say we were brutes. We want heroes, not brutes. The brutes are other people. And that's not unique to America. No one wants to admit the depth of hurt and harm that our ideas and policies have caused. And one of my challenges in the work that I do is one of equanimity, of trying to balance the burden of these issues. It is not about an anti-Americanism. That's another way of not dealing with the issue. It's about balancing the fact that white people, for lack of a better term, also started the abolitionist movement. Also that the social justice movements were being challenged by the very people that were viewed as oppressors, by giving voice to the complexity of the issue, and that there were competing issues. Should women get the right to vote? Should we end slavery? We can't do them both. And then there were divisions within even social justice movements, or the chauvinism within the civil rights movement, where women were never given credit. I mean, it's in all of us, no matter, and I think that's a positive thing in that it's not about one group who failed in these ways. It's about the human being who fails in these ways. And we fail no matter our background. We fail no matter our background. It's deeper. It's about looking at humanity. And it's painful. Yeah, one of the films I show is called The Shadow of Hate. The students can barely handle it. It's a review of American history from that reality. And then I take the next 2 class meetings to visit it so that it's not overpowering in its darkness, but it's important for them to have a dose of the counter narrative. It is intense. I need them to be uncomfortable. I'm not going to leave them there. That's not but it's shocking to them. And it would be shocking to anyone.
All right, we end this episode with one last comment from Associate Professor Paula Ionita.
Here, what we have to think about is what kind of person actually is willing to receive knowledge? What kind of person is willing to actually be willing to integrate that knowledge? And what would that do to who they think that they are? So if all of a sudden I actually accept the fact that, not just on my merit alone, but because the United States has a history of sort of giving white advantages through actual policies. For example, the FHA gave mortgage loans from the 1930s to the 1960s, right? 98% of those FHA loans went to whites and not to people of color, giving them an advantage in homeownership and therefore wealth accumulation. But if I think, I earned that on my own, right? And I'm not willing to let go of that belief because I'm not willing to integrate the fact that I actually received a federally subsidized advantage, what does that say about who I am? Well, first of all, it says, I'm not willing to integrate this information because that information is requiring me to change the worldview of who I am and how I think I got to where I am and who I think is subordinate to me, right? Because supposedly they didn't work hard enough and they didn't do what my grandparents did, which is sort of pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So conservative ideology depends on feelings much more than facts. And what they've been extremely successful at, in contrast to the left, who has been actually highly unsuccessful at this, I would say, is to shape public feelings around a set of false beliefs that actually work as if they are true in people's minds. And then no matter how much you sort of say, but the sociological facts actually say this, it doesn't matter because that belief has become really central to that person's sense of who they are. And they're not willing to let go of it. It's a structure that works much more on an emotional level than it does on a rational level.
That wraps up episode number 6. Hope that gave you some food for thought, especially the fact that the victors write the history. We've all experienced that reality growing up and attending grade school, middle school, and high school in America. I hope you'll join me for episode number 7, The Way Forward with Vote Common Good. Thanks and take care.